Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, I want to thank you for your patience with the previous presentation where opposing counsel argued that their client, Edward De Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was not responsible for the crime of writing the Shakespeare poems and plays. And, they make a pretty good superficial case, I think. I'm not going to cover all the points, but I'm going to at least address one or two. One of which is the idea that, he died in 1604, and since Shakespeare plays were published and performed after his death, it couldn't be him. Well, if that's a standard you're going to go by, then say goodbye to Antony and Cleopatra, Coriolanus, and Time of Athens, because they weren't published until the first folio and not performed in Shakespeare's lifetime, so bye-bye. I don't think we're going to have any truck with that standard. They said a lot of unkind things about my client, Will Shakespeare of Stratford, who they regard as the prime suspect for the crime of writing these poems and plays. They made a lot of interesting external points, and by external they would point to the first folio, they would point to Ben Jonson, and Ben Jonson talks about the Stratford Monument. Oh wait, they forgot to tell you about the original one with the sack of wool, which more fits my client, by the way. I'm sure the next argument will be, well, actually it's actually a bag full of Shakespeare plays, and right there you can kind of see the edge of Hamlet. And then they talk about the coincidence of the names, and as many of you already know, almost everything you can directly connect to Will. So short A, everything you can connect to the plays, long A. So for my part, it's all very superficial, and I say it's external. There are a lot of holes that they don't really address. They try to make up things. They try to say cool things like, oh, here's what they don't talk about. There's no evidence of an education of any sort, or even that he was literate. In fact, his daughters were illiterate, and if you think about it, how many of you have illiterate children who have children? Yeah, it was very common in those days. Well, yeah, I'm sorry I brought it up. But no surviving letters of proof that ever he wrote one or that he wrote any plays. In fact, I understand there was one famous scholar who said that he never wrote a play, he never wrote a letter to his mother, and he never wrote a note to the milkman. And of course, I already mentioned names not spelled like those on the plays. No eulogies when he died in 1616. No one directly tied him to the poems and plays during his lifetime. Even his son-in-law, John Hall, made no mention of him, however, did mention this excellent poet, Michael Drayton. That's kind of a weird thing. They may have had some issues. His will mentions no manuscripts, books, certainly his most prized possessions, if he were the poet. All literary references to Shakespeare are ambiguous, including those by Ben Jonson in the first folio. No legitimate portrait of him exists. I could go on and on down those lines, but that's not where I'm going to make my case. That my client, Will Shakespeare of Stratford, is not the one you should indict for the crime of doing these plays. What they say, though, you see, they don't really talk about what goes on in his head. They don't have the internal evidence. They just say he's a genius. He's this kind of blind. He's like the academic that sits in his ivory tower and has all of his books and thinks, I'm going to create great literature just not having, I don't have to experience the world. That's not how genius works. What I say is, when they say that, when opposing counsel talks about genius, they're doing something called the Satan maneuver. I remember seeing a very fundamentalist evangelical minister make the claim that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. And the interviewer was saying, well, what about all the scientific evidence, the fossils they found that show that it's millions and millions of years old? And the minister said, Satan put them there. Now, that is a very sophisticated move when you're in the realm of argument and evidence, because it completely short-circuits any need to address arguments and evidence, because it's a magical explanation. You can explain, why did that happen? Satan did it. How come I behaved this way? Well, Satan caused me to do it. How did Shakespeare have all this knowledge? Well, he was a genius, right? It's a Satan maneuver. Once you point to genius, you got all the answers. You don't need evidence and reason. Or there's the other form of it. It's called the Universal Tavern of Knowledge. Where did he get his law terms if he never studied? Well, he hangs out in the tavern and there's a lawyer there and it's like, I have this legal scene here. Could you check over my work? Am I getting the terms right? Oh, you were just at Italy? Look, Venice. I want to do a Venice scene. What do you think? And of course, all of them would look at, here's the other one. Yeah, I'm doing this play, Richard II, on power. How does that, I know you're a courtier, right? Wait, why you look at me like that? This is not how one acquires or generates great art. What I'm interested in is the internal consciousness of the writer of these plays, and that's where I'm going to compile the evidence. There's a lot of people who doubted it, as you know, Coleridge, Hardy, Whitman, Emerson, Twain, Henry James. And of course, Supreme Court justices also had doubts about my client. And if I needed to cite authorities, I'd go in that direction. Or even some famous actors, Gielgud, Chaplin, Jacoby Rylance, Michael York, among others. But again, I'm more interested in a certain kind of circumstantial evidence. And let me give you my take on circumstantial evidence so you understand what I mean. Suppose a suspect in a crime was a man who was wearing Ferragamo shoes. If you're wearing Ferragamo shoes, you're guilty. Not enough. So a single point is not enough. Suppose there's another crime and the suspect was seen he's thin and tall with long red hair. Do I go out and arrest everybody tall and thin with red hair, long red hair? No, one instance is not enough. Same in a third case, suspect seen leaving a crime in a white 65 Mustang with bald tires. Okay, maybe there's fewer people like that, but there's probably still more than one and nobody would convict. The power of circumstantial evidence comes when they start compiling themselves into a bunch. Yes, this one suspect wore Ferragamo shoes, was tall with thin red hair, drove a white 65 Mustang with bald tires. Together they start generating some power and some willingness. Maybe this is the guy, because he has all these in common. And so as circumstantial evidence piles up, a picture emerges. And I liken it to pointillist art. Right? I mean, what is this? Well, I don't know. I mean, there's some dots there. It could be something. There seems to be a pattern, but what you need to do is you need to, over time, add more points, and as the full picture, the picture emerges as more points come together. So you can say, oh yeah, that's a sailboat on water. There's a bank, there's trees, sky. I get it. But I have to have enough points for the image to emerge. So I'm going to make a circumstantial case mostly based on internal evidence, on the consciousness of whoever wrote the plays. We'll kind of start here. What do we know about this person based on the text? And I think that over time you'll notice that the picture that emerges is not my client. It'll be Edward De Vere, the 18th Earl of Oxford. If you're going to indict one of these two for the crime of writing the plays, the evidence, the preponderance of evidence is right there. And that's your job to decide. So, let's begin. Let's talk about Shakespeare's library. Oh, by the way, for the most part, the testimony I'm going to bring forward, it's their guys. Their guys who say, my guy is guilty. We're going to use their words because it's a very funny phenomenon. When they're not thinking about who the author is, they'll say all these wonderful and amazing things about Shakespeare. And then as soon as you start bringing up authorship, they start getting a little squishy on it, and they'll start shifting ground and changing. They become shapeshifters. So, Anders, in Shakespeare's books, Shakespeare's knowledge of the Latin language was considerable, and he must have read some of the most important or more important Latin authors. E.K. Chambers, one may reasonably assume that at all times Shakespeare read whatever books, original or translated, came his way. That because in Stratford, right next to his home, was the Stratford Library, and I'm sure he had his library card. He could walk over, check out a book, take it in, and master it. Sister Mary and Joseph, in Shakespeare's use of the arts of language, he utilized every resource of thought and language known to his time. So, yeah, when you look at the plays, whew, well read. Well, as we know, Oxford, my opposing counsel's client, had access to probably the most impressive library in England at Cecil House from the age of 12 on. Cecil was an insatiable book buyer. His household indeed was currently regarded as the best training school for the gentry. It was the perfect place to have access to all these books. But even younger, he spent some time in another household with one of his tutors. He was tutored by Arthur Golding, by Lawrence Knoll, Sir Thomas Smith, in Sir Thomas Smith's home, all access to all the books that we're talking about. So of the two, I mean, there's no evidence that my client ever read a book or could read a book. That's one little point on the canvas. The Geneva Bible, Anders says, if Shakespeare read a Bible, it was the Geneva version. Noble says the evidence in favor of Shakespeare's possession of a Geneva Old Testament. However, my client, well, let's not even talk about books. We do have evidence that Oxford owned a Geneva Bible because it's in the Folgers. It's been documented to have a lot of references connected to Shakespeare's plays. So another dot on the canvas. Shakespeare's knowledge of law. Okay, I could go on for an hour on this. I'm going to only take a couple minutes because you don't need much on this. I mean, this goes back to 1790. They were recognizing his knowledge of legal terms is not merely such as might be acquired by the casual observation or the universal tavern of knowledge. Richard Grant White, legal phrases flow from his pen as part of his vocabulary and parcel of his thought. Cushman Davis, where such knowledge is unexampled in other writers, unlearned in the law, Shakespeare appears in perfect possession of them. Goes on, Edgar J. White, almost every play displays great legal learning, not only of legal terms, but of the science and philosophy of law as well. I mean, almost every play, wait a minute. I only remember a few plays with legal scenes, but that's not what's triggering this in a lawyer. What's remarkable about Shakespeare is that the law is such a part of him, and not just legal terms, but the science and philosophy of law, that it naturally pops up in non-legal contexts as metaphors throughout. And if you were to look into this, you would be surprised how many sonnets, how many plays have legal metaphors that you don't even realize are legal. But to lawyers, when they read it, it's saturated. Chinese Chief Justice John C. Wu said, Shakespeare knows his common law and natural law pretty well. He knows the psychological reason for case law. What? He knows the psychological reason for case law. See, this points to something very interesting, because a lot of people over the decades would like to, was Shakespeare a lawyer, was the question. And I say, no, that's not really the case here. It's not that he was a lawyer, an advocate for one side or the other. Shakespeare was a judge. He was the person who could weigh and balance competing ideas and philosophies and theories. He shows that kind of equipoise and balance that comes in judicially looking at evidence. And this translates throughout his works. my client, Will Shakespeare Stratford, was not a judge. However, Oxford not only matriculated at Gray's Inn, he was a judge on the Mary Queen of Scots trial and the Essex trial. In fact, as part of his earldom, he was a judge on a lot of local cases. It was part of his role. In fact, he was raised in the most legal political household in the country, and obviously his position required that he had a formidable legal education. Tutor Tom Smith was an acknowledged scholar in civil law, so he was saturated in the law. And this is the thing, whatever you are a master of, the metaphors leap up. If you get your PhD in mathematics or theoretical physics or any other discipline, the terms there, if you start creating art, the metaphors will naturally come up. You're going to see in your genius the connections, and that's where metaphors arise. Knowledge of music. Well, let's see. Our Orthodox scholar Naylor says that the musical student should look in Shakespeare for music and find it treated of him from several points of view, completely and accurately. Sternfeld, the method that is peculiar to Shakespeare, the employment of song and instrumental music to a degree hitherto unknown, and their use as an integral part of the dramatic structure. This is also what makes Mozart's operas so significant, that because the more you know the music of those operas, you realize that Mozart paints character with music. He integrates the music into the story and into building the characters. Apparently, Shakespeare did the same thing in reverse. He has his plays, but he uses music to inform it in exactly the same way that Mozart did. And this is why I would argue the Mozartian consciousness and the Shakespearean consciousness are parallel. Reader's Encyclopedia of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's familiarity with the music of his time is indicated by more than 500 passages in his works. Shakespeare's use of vocal music in his plays are manifold and always purposeful, complete and indispensable integration with the drama in order to illuminate character or carry the action forward. Now, it's well known that my client, Will of Stratford, played the lute, played the flute, no, he didn't do anything. He may have sang a little ditty in the field, but that's probably as far as it goes. Oxford, on the other hand, was known as an accomplished musician, a patron of music. John Farmer dedicated 2 books to him. There's even works that we believe may have been written by him. And look at what John Farmer said in one of his dedications. Those that know your lordship know this, that using this science as a recreation, your lordship have overgone most of those that make it a profession. To number you here amongst the favorers of music and the practicers. So not only was he, did he use music, he was a musician and obviously a composer, and he integrated it into the plays. More dots on the canvas. Okay, knowledge of power. This one I really like. And this is where I depart from the testimony of just Orthodox scholars, because Walt Whitman did not believe that my client committed the crime of writing these poems and plays. He says, only one of the wolfish earls, so plaintiffs in the plays themselves or some born descendant of Noah, might seem to be the true author of those amazing works. And that's before we had even our suspect of Edward De Vere. H.B. Charlton in Shakespeare, Politics and Politicians, referring to the history plays. A better name would be political plays, for they are plays in which the prevailing dramatic interest is in the fate of a nation. Since that is their nature, there will be in them much of what Shakespeare's insight had apprehended of the forces which shape a nation's destiny. Yes, my client was really concerned about the fate of nations and how power worked in them. Goes further, and this book came out in 1965. It's called Power by Adolph Burrell, who was in the Kennedy administration and got to see up front what happens to power holders, especially when they leave office, and how the lack of power changes them. He says the interplays of personality and power is constant. Perhaps the best education a power holder could have would be a solid acquaintance with Shakespeare's plays. Who had access to the power brokers of England at the time. Well, it turns out Oxford dwelled at the center of England's power, with an insider's experience with Elizabeth, the machinations of foreign heads of states and ambassadors and fawning courtiers. I mean, he saw it all. It was part of his job. Rouse says that as hereditary Lord Great Chamberlain took his place on the right hand of the Queen and bore the sword of state before her. So again, how about ... on this one? And do you understand what I mean by internal evidence? We're talking about the consciousness that's in the place, and now we're talking about the consciousness of the Earl of Oxford. This is the evidence that becomes persuasive. For me, the stories that reveal consciousness are the ones that are most persuasive, not the external data that piles up, although that can help or hinder. Golding's Metamorphosis. Let's talk about specific books. Francis Meres, right, as a contemporary, said the sweet, witty soul of Ovid lives in mellifluous and hunting tongue Shakespeare, and people recognize that. Orthodox scholars, they know if Shakespeare read Ovid, so he read Golding. Jonathan Bate, easy familiarity with Ovidian narrative was as much due to Golding, so it was Golding's Metamorphosis. And of course, Golding was Oxford's uncle, and they lived together at Cecil House when he started writing these, did the translations of these. I mean, it's an incredible, it's just a coincidence. Okay. But again, you get enough coincidences, you get pattern, and once you get patterns, you get enough dots on the canvas, the image emerges. Castiglione, the courtier. Well, without Castiglione, we should not have Hamlet, right? The Merry War of Beatrice and Benedict in Much Ado may be derived from a similar exchange of wit in the courtier. Well, Oxford's tutor, Bartholomew Clerk, who translated the courtier, and Oxford wrote the Latin preface. And it was such a literary preface that Gabriel Harvey said, let that courtly epistle, more polished even than the writings of Castiglione himself, witness how greatly thou dost excel in letters. So a book intimate to the Shakespeare consciousness is also intimate to the Oxfordian consciousness. Cardano's Comfort. Regarding Hamlet's to be or not to be soliloquy, Cardano's Comfort, a book which Shakespeare had certainly read. Others go further. Seems to be the book which Shakespeare placed in the hands of Hamlet. It is easily seen that this book of Cardan has long been associated with Hamlet. I should like to believe that Hamlet was actually reading it or pretending to read it as he carried on his baiting of Polonius. My client doesn't read books. Their client, well, Thomas Bedingfield dedicated his 1571 translation of Cardano's Comfort to Oxford, and even reveals that the translation was at Oxford's bidding. Another intimate connection of consciousness, internal. More dots. Knowledge of Italy, Shakespeare visited Upper Italy, especially Venice. Shakespeare evinces a varied and profound knowledge of the country in general and of our cities in particular. This is familiar territory. Plays had all these locations: Venice, Genoa, Milan, Padua, Florence, Verona, Messina. My client went to the taverns to talk to Italian travelers to pick up all this intimate knowledge, whereas Oxford actually spent time there in Upper Italy, visiting all the cities mentioned in his plays. There's a lot more. Again, I'm like skipping flat rocks on the surface of things. We're not digging down into any depth here. But again, more dots on the canvas. Let's move from knowledge to acquaintances. Because, you know, we would like to make sure that whoever wrote these plays was connected to other playwrights, other people who were poets. Karen Cross in The Problem of Hamlet says, the form Cordelia comes from Spenser alone. Reader's Encyclopedia, numerous verbal parallels suggest that Shakespeare was familiar with Spenser's work. Well, Spenser dedicated a sonnet to Oxford in The Faerie Queen, where he mentions the relationship to the Heliconian imps, you know, connecting him to the muses. And let's remember what the muses are connected to. Love poets, epic poets, sacred poets, writers of tragedies, comedies, musicians, dancers, all of which are associated with opposing counsel's client. More dots on the canvas. John Lilly, Shakespeare's intimate knowledge of the two parts of Euphues. Shakespeare's first comedy, Love's Labour's Lost, is a direct imitation of Lilly's comedies, perhaps the largest single influence on that spacious genre, Shakespearean comedy. But which way did the influence go? Well, Lilly was Oxford's secretary, dedicated Euphues' England to him. They worked together producing plays. So it's more likely our opposing counsel's client is the one who did the original, and perhaps Lilly was copying him or being influenced by him. Anthony Munday. Munday's first extant play is Fidele and Fortunio, and may have been used by Shakespeare as one of his sources for Much Ado. There's a pair of plays on Robin Hood from 1598. May have influenced As You Like It. Well, again, are these playwrights that influenced Shakespeare or the opposite? Because Munday worked for Oxford, who was his patron, dedicated several works to him. He joined Oxford's acting troupe, Oxford's Men. Again, more intimate dots on the canvas. Other acquaintances, well, Henry Wriothesley, Venus and Adonis. Obviously, the writer put his stamp on that. Did they know each other? Well, obviously Oxford did. Cecil sought a marriage between Southampton and Oxford's daughter, Elizabeth Vere, somewhere around the time this was published, before or after, I'm not sure. Earls of Pembroke and Montgomery, those to whom the first folio is dedicated. No connection to my guy. I mean, they say there would be, but Pembroke was once in negotiations with Cecil to marry Oxford's daughter, Bridget Vere, and of course, Montgomery actually did marry Oxford's other daughter, Susan Vere. If you ever think about where would some of the manuscripts come from and get handed down so they could probably make their way into or somehow influence the first folio, perhaps through his daughter. More dots on the canvas. Let's talk about Hamlet as autobiography, because here's where there's a lot of connections. And this is where, at a certain point, there's no escaping who should be indicted. Frank Harrison, the man Shakespeare and his tragic life story. Even if it be admitted that Hamlet is the most complex and profound character of Shakespeare's creations, and therefore probably the character in which Shakespeare revealed most of himself, the question of degree remains to be determined. Oh, I think we can determine it. Harold C. Goddard, to nearly everyone, both Hamlet himself and the play give the impression of having some peculiarly intimate relation to their creator. And keep in mind, I'm using their testimony. Well, it's often been thought that Polonius may glance at Lord Burleigh, especially with his certain precepts. Dover Wilson went further. Polonius is almost without doubt intended as a caricature of Burleigh. And yes, my client is going to caricature the most powerful man in England, or near. Joel Hirschfeld, in a couple quotes, in the 50s, he says, on Burleigh's wordiness, it is the authentic voice of Polonius, but he goes further a few years later, William Cecil Lord Burleigh, Shakespeare's Polonius. And if that weren't enough, well, we know that Oxford grew up in that household, and they were at odds with each other, so that's akin to Hamlet and Shakespeare, because it starts putting Oxford firmly in the frame for Hamlet. There's Anne Cecil as well. As early as 1869, Anne Cecil, the fair Ophelia of the play. They made the connection that long ago. 1920, Cecil was careful not to let Elizabeth or anyone else think that ambition for his daughter could tempt him into unwise political plans. In exactly the same way, we find Polonius guarding himself against any suspicion that he may have encouraged Hamlet's advances to Ophelia. More dots on the canvas. And since they grew up in the same household and were later unhappily married, the connection should be pretty obvious. In fact, when Stanley goes further, there is a further curious parallel in the fact that when Cecil's daughter married De Vere, Earl of Oxford, the husband turned sulky, separated himself from his wife, and declared it was Cecil's fault for influencing his wife against him. Where does that sound familiar? But here's one more nail in the coffin, as some might say. Cecil's Latin motto was cor unum via una, one heart, one way. But as W. Gregg points out in the editorial problem in Shakespeare regarding the Q1 of Hamlet, for some obscure reason, the names Corambus and Montano were substituted for Polonius and Rinaldo. Well, it's not that obscure when you realize Corambus alludes to the Latin cor ambo for double-hearted, which means he's sticking it to Cecil's motto. And of course, once we get to the official version of the play, are they going to allow that name on the play? No, it gets changed to Polonius. And they also changed Montano because Montano points to a mountain like a hunchback would have. Oh, no, that wouldn't fly. So it becomes Rinaldo. There's other striking parallels. Noblemen, they were both noblemen and courtiers, both attacked by pirates, had mothers who remarried after their father's death, were spied upon by father-in-law or potential father-in-law, were patrons to players and playwrights, had a lover whose father was counselor to the throne, had a lover accused of infidelity who dies untimely, had been thought mad by others in court. ... The Earl of Oxford is Hamlet. How do you get away from that? And it's interesting when you study the history of this, how decade after decade, yes, they make the connection, and then they start going, wait a minute, what's this Oxfordian theory? And then they start distancing themselves, and then you look at the Arden editions, and then the latest edition starts removing all the commentary on Corambus, so you don't even get to read it now. There's other autobiography and other works. I'll just point to one. The Gad's Hill episode in Henry IV, Part 1, where they all decide to get together and have fun doing a little robbery at Gad's Hill. Gad's Hill lies tonight in Rochester. If you will go, I will stuff your purses full of crowns, and how goes along with that. There's money of the king's coming down the hill. It's going to the king's exchequer. Well, interesting. In 1573, Oxford's men conducted a similar prank in the same location. Gad's Hill is located in Kent on the highway between Rochester and Gravesend. And in the letter from William Font and John Wilton, former associates of Oxford, they described the scene. They were apparently traveling on the business connected with the exchequer. So it maps down to very intimate particulars. ... Word creation, more about consciousness. The OED lists Shakespeare as the earliest known user in public documents of many words. So 1609, the OED says Troilus and Cressida was where they found the first use of the word bifold, but go back 8 years earlier, Oxford used the same word in one of the letters, bifold. There's more. 1591 OED, two gentlemen of Roma, where you see the first use of two words, despairing and disgraced. Go back 15 years, Oxford used both in a poem, despairing and disgrace, in Paradise of Deigning Devices. 1660 OED, they note that as the first use of restoration. Should be revised because in 1603, Shakespeare uses it, but in 1593, Oxford used it. So again, consciousness is the connection, ... In the Sonnet 121, Shakespeare does something unusual. He uses the phrase, I am that I am. That's not something that shows up very much except in the Bible. In a letter to Burleigh in 1584, Oxford uses the exact same term, I am that I am. And you get the real sense of intimate language connections at a level that you don't see with my client at least, because he never wrote anything. Let's look at the literary accolades for Oxford. These are the kind of accolades you would think Shakespeare would get. John Southern input, Pandora, De Vere merits a silver pen, eternally to write his honor. A man so honored as thee, and both of the muses and me, the muses come up again. William Webb, the Right Honorable Earl of Oxford may challenge to himself the title of the most excellent among the rest, regarding poetry. The Art of English Poesy of noblemen who have written excellently well, if their doings could be made public with the rest, of which number is first the noble gentleman, Edward, Earl of Oxford. Francis Mears, the best for comedy among us, be Edward, Earl of Oxford. Chapman, I overtook, coming from Italy, a great and famous earl, valiant and learned and liberal as the sun, spoke and writ sweetly, or of learned subjects, or of the discipline of public weals, and 'twas the Earl of Oxford. It's interesting, though, all of this, and we know he's a playwright, best for comedy. We have his juvenilia. We don't have mature works. Shakespeare, we don't have juvenilia. We have mature works. Henry Peacham, in The Complete Gentleman, in the time of our late Queen Elizabeth, above others who honored poesy with their pens and practice was Edward, Earl of Oxford. Peacham mentions Oxford, but not Shakespeare. And this is in 1622. Levenshuking, Orthodox scholar, a fundamental feature of Hamlet's character is a fanatical sense of the truth. And this idea shows up in Shakespeare. Truth is truth to the end of reckoning. Of course, in Latin, Vere means truly, or according to truth. The motto, vel nihil verius, nothing truer than truth, or nothing truer than the true man. In a letter to Robert Cecil, De Vere wrote, "For truth is truth, though never so old, and time cannot make that false, which once was true." I'm going to enter the testimony of one person in its entirety. David McCullough, famed historian, author of Truman, John Adams, among others. He had National Book Awards Medal for distinguished contributions to letter and the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor. Let me read this. This is the foreword in the book by Charlton Ogburn Jr., and I think sometimes people do not fully take into account what he says. I must have glasses. There we are. It was over, let me put up the text for you. There we go. It was over dinner in a Washington restaurant nearly 20 years ago that I first talked about the mystery of William Shakespeare. We had met to discuss a book on geology of North America, a book he was to write and I was to edit. At that point, I knew him only as the author of several books. I had greatly enjoyed The Gold of the River Sea, The Winter Beach, a writer of intelligence and integrity and wonderful feeling for the natural world. Of his interest in Shakespeare, I knew nothing. But once he got started on the subject, I could hardly let him stop, though until then, like most everybody, I'd been perfectly willing to accept the man from Stratford-on-Avon as the author of the plays and sonnets. And while I knew there were those who raised doubts about that, I imagined that they were mostly cranks. Like most of the people in this room, we started out maybe a little cranky. He was absolutely spellbinding. The case he made against the man from Stratford-on-Avon seemed to me astonishing against my client, overwhelming. And the more he went on, the more impressed I was both by his penetrating mind and his phenomenal grasp of the subject. He seemed to understand Shakespeare better than anyone I had ever met. I kept thinking, what a shame his audience wasn't larger. Now comes the mysterious William Shakespeare. And this brilliant, powerful book is a major event for everyone who cares about Shakespeare. The scholarship is surpassing, brave, original, full of surprise. And in the hands of so gifted a writer, it fairly lights up the sky. Looking back on that evening years ago, I felt as if I had been witness to the beginnings of a literary landmark. Nothing comparable has ever been published. Anyone who considers the Shakespeare controversial silly or a lot of old stuff is in for a particular surprise. This is scholarly detective work at its most absorbing. More, it is close analysis by a writer with a rare sense of humanity. The strange, difficult, contradictory man who emerges as the real Shakespeare, Edward De Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, is not just plausible, but fascinating and wholly believable. It is hard to imagine anyone who reads the book with an open mind ever seeing Shakespeare of his works the same way again. That Charlton Ogburn persisted and succeeded in so monumental a task, all alone, without institutional backing, without the support or blessing of academia, makes the accomplishment all the more extraordinary. David McCullough. So the picture emerges, Shakespeare's knowledge of law, music, Italy, language, power. I could have talked about gardens, because Cecil House had one of the great gardens and one of the most famous gardeners whose knowledge was complete. Shakespeare's books, Golding's Metamorphoses, Castiglione's The Courtier, Carden's Comfort, all this, intimate to Shakespeare and intimate to De Vere. Shakespeare's acquaintances, Spenser, Lilly, Munday, the Earls of Southampton, Pembroke, and Montgomery. Shakespeare and Hamlet, Shakespeare's word creation, literary accolades, the testimony of historian David McCullough. If writing the plays and poem is a crime and you are the grand jury, I think it's pretty clear my client is innocent. When you put together all the dots on the canvas, there is only one picture that emerges, and that is Edward De Vere, 17th Earl of Oxford. Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury, the defense rests.